In room 9A, Jasmine Crockett asked one question, and Barron Trump's silence said everything. She never named names, but pointed to a 2-page visa, an 87-day approval, and a woman who walked through America's toughest gate unchecked. Hours later, Barron filed a lawsuit, sharp personal, meant to shut her down. But the more he pressed, the more the truth bled through, line by line stamped in red. When power hides behind privilege, what happens when someone finally drags it into the light? Stay with us, this is a story worth every second of your time. The room was cold windowless and sunk deep beneath the Capitol Room 9A, known among staffers as the room where policies go to disappear. Rows of suits filled the long, U-shaped table. Binders were stacked, ties were tightened, and no one looked like they were there to listen. It was the final hearing of the fiscal quarter, a closed-door session titled High Priority Immigration Allocation Review. Jasmine Crockett sat at the far right, silently flipping through her notes, while others recited pre-approved questions. She hadn't spoken a word all day, but now as the chairman nodded to her, the final speaker, she leaned forward, dropped her pen, and spoke without looking at her folder. How many people in this country got an EB-1 visa because of actual extraordinary talent? She asked, her voice steady, not loud, but sharp enough to slice through every breath in the room. And how many just knew the right person? A ripple of tension moved through the air, like static before a storm. Staffers exchanged nervous glances. One assistant clutched their phone just a bit tighter. Jasmine didn't blink. She raised her chin, looked directly at the deputy from the SUES, and continued. Because if a lingerie model from Eastern Europe can squeeze through the EB-1 gate faster than a Nobel-nominated physician, then maybe we don't need to build a wall. She paused. We need a mirror. For 3 seconds, no one moved. The pen tapping stopped. The rustling of papers vanished. Even the HVAC vents seemed to fall silent. Barron Trump sat in the third row behind the Department of Homeland Security panel there as a private consultant for strategic review. His eyes narrowed. His jaw clenched. He knew exactly who she meant, and Jasmine knew he knew. She didn't look at him, not yet, but the silence between them was louder than any gavel. The chairman cleared his throat and fumbled for his water. Congresswoman Crockett, please confine your remarks to the document at hand, he said. Jasmine nodded, but not in apology. It was the kind of nod that said, I've just begun. She closed her folder slowly, deliberately, as if the truth didn't need paper to stand on. Barron sat frozen, his fingers digging into the armrest. The room had become a live wire, and she had just touched it with both hands. From that moment on, no one remembered any other question asked that day. The silence didn't end when Jasmine left the room. It followed her, heavy and electric, gripping the corridors like the residue of a bomb no one heard explode. She walked steadily through the west wing of the Capitol's sub-level, past closed doors and blank stares. Every step of her heels echoed against the marble like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Her body was calm, but inside her chest, adrenaline moved like smoke. She had dropped a match into a house built on special favors, and everyone knew it. Jasmine Crockett wasn't a stranger to backlash, but today she'd struck blood. Then the hallway changed. The air shifted. She didn't need to look to feel it. He was there. Barron Trump stood waiting at the elevator bay alone. No staffers, no handlers. Just him, and in his right hand, a manila envelope held with surgical precision. His suit was crisp, posture locked, but his eyes, they were dark and fixed not on the floor or her shoes or the nameplate behind her, but directly, unwaveringly at Jasmine. She stopped 2 paces from him, not surprised, just ready. He stepped forward, smooth and deliberate, like someone used to walking through doors others held open. His voice was measured, not loud, but carried the bite of entitlement, sharpened by generational power. You crossed a line. He extended the envelope. I'm going to teach you what happens when you drag my mother's name through the dirt. Inside the envelope, a federal civil complaint filed in the U.S. District Court of D.C., accusing Jasmine of defamation, reputational harm, and malicious intent toward a former First Lady. It was real, numbered, stamped, a lawsuit crafted not just to punish, but to silence. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Jasmine reached out and took the envelope with a steady hand. Her eyes never left his. I didn't say her name, she replied, low and even. But if the truth landed too close to your house, maybe that's not my fault. That line hit harder than any slap. Barron's jaw tightened. He didn't respond, not because he couldn't, but because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound weak. Jasmine turned toward the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. The metal door slid open with a chime that sounded far too gentle for the moment. She stepped in without turning back. As the doors closed, they locked eyes one last time, not as adversaries, but as two people who now understood this was no longer a disagreement. This was war. Not loud, not public, but surgical, precise, quiet like a fuse. And there were no journalists in the hallway to witness it, no cameras to catch the exchange, just power, truth, and the space between them crackling irreversible. And just like that, the war baron had tried to wage behind closed doors was dragged into the light, not with shouting, but with silence wrapped in subpoenas. The courtroom of 14B inside the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia wasn't designed for drama. It was beige boxy, built to suppress noise and emotion. But that morning, the tension inside didn't need music or cameras. It vibrated through the walls like a held breath, waiting to explode. Barron Trump sat stiff at the plaintiff's table, flanked by three high-profile attorneys in dark suits and tighter jaws. Across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett adjusted the single button on her blazer. Her eyes weren't tired, they were focused. Cold fire. She hadn't come to defend herself. She had come to dismantle the room. Her lead counsel stepped forward holding a binder marked in white EB1 Visa Denial Analysis, 2017-2022. He spoke only once, 273 cases. Denied, every one of them. Then he clicked the remote and the screen lit up with rows of names like Dr. Fatin Al-Hassan, Professor Guillermo Estrada, Chinwejo, each followed by phrases like breakthrough cancer researcher, global infrastructure consultant, UNESCO cultural laureate. Denied, denied, denied. Then slide 274, a single name, centered, simple, Melania Naus Trump, approved in 87 days. No awards, no publications, no citations, just a line portfolio attached. Expedited per POTUS request. Gasps were stifled into coughs. One juror leaned forward. Barron stiffened but didn't speak. He didn't need to. The numbers had started speaking for themselves. That's when Jasmine stood. She didn't ask for permission like she was unsure, she requested it, like a formality. Her voice was steady, clear. Your Honor, I would like to present this next portion myself. The judge, a man known for his intolerance of spectacle, gave a single nod. Jasmine walked toward the podium as if it were a ledge and she had no fear of the fall. The room followed her with their eyes, not because she demanded it, but because they couldn't look away. She planted her palms on the oak surface, leaned in just enough to let gravity settle and spoke into the stillness, like slicing through paper with a blade. Melania was granted an EB1 visa in 87 days. No awards, no published research, no global achievement recognized by any body of merit, and we're calling that a system. She paused not for effect, but because the weight of the silence made the moment heavier. Because to the other 273 people in this report, we didn't say yes in 87 days. We said no, repeatedly, systematically, silently. Barron's chair scraped loudly as he stood. Your Honor, I object. This is character assassination, irrelevant and inflammatory. His voice cracked not from weakness, but from real fear. The kind of fear that grows when the ground starts shifting and you realize the spotlight isn't on your opponent, it's on your history. The judge didn't blink. He looked at Barron like a teacher stares down a student who didn't read the assignment. The numbers cited are from official DHS archives. She may continue. And right then, in a courtroom where everyone expected her to defend herself, Jasmine did something else entirely. She made them question the system itself, not with accusations, not with anger, but with facts laid out like a scalpel across a body politic that always claimed it was blind, but now had no excuse not to see. The numbers had torn at the credibility of the system. The personal story had cracked its moral core. But Jasmine knew the final blow wouldn't come from emotion or math. It would come from the paper trail. Cold, dry, government issued. Because when systems fall, they don't fall from fury. They fall from facts no one can refute. Her tone was firm but composed as she faced the judge once again. Your Honor, I respectfully request the court to open and review the sealed exhibit application. Number 1467 immigration category for individuals with extraordinary ability filed under the name Melania Naus. Her words landed with quiet force. There were no objections from the other side. Not because they agreed, but because they didn't dare draw attention to the file. They had built their defense on avoiding this very moment. The judge hesitated for only a beat. Then he nodded once. Granted. A court clerk stood up from the bench, crossed to a locked cabinet, and retrieved a heavy envelope marked with red stripes along the edges. It bore the seal of the Department of Homeland Security and an internal code flagging it for special handling. The clerk sliced it open, slipped the contents out, and handed them to the judge. What unfolded next didn't explode at cut. There were no letters of recommendation from professional organizations, no evidence of international recognition, no supporting documents from leading figures in science, art, medicine, or business. There were no research papers, no awards, no academic degrees or citations, just 2 pages of portfolio of modeling photos printed on glossy paper. And at the top of the attached cover sheet, stamped in unmistakable red type, it read, Presidential Interest, Expedite Request. You could feel the oxygen leave the room. The lead attorney for the plaintiff froze mid-page. One juror blinked repeatedly, as if trying to unsee what they had just seen. Another leaned back slowly, as if their chair had suddenly become too small to hold the weight of what was happening. Someone in the gallery dropped a pen. The sound was sharper than expected. No one bent down to pick it up. Across the courtroom, Barron Trump sat stone still, but the tension in his shoulders told a different story. His fingers clenched the edge of the table so tightly the skin blanched. His lips tightened into a hard, unreadable line. It wasn't just that the document was damaging, it was that it was unmistakable. Jasmine stepped forward. She didn't need theatrics. The documents were doing all the screaming. But still her words cut deeper than any headline could. If this is what we're calling extraordinary contribution, then what does that make the thousands who were denied her voice didn't rise? It sank, like a stone dropped into something deep and still forcing everyone to listen because they couldn't look away. She turned slowly to the jury, letting her eyes pause on each face, not to intimidate, but to connect, to ask the question they now had to answer for themselves. Trash data, statistical noise, disposable talent. No one answered. Not the plaintiff, not the attorneys, not the gallery. The only sound was the low hum of the ceiling vent, and even that felt like it didn't belong there anymore. Jasmine didn't press the silence. She let it grow. Because in that silence, something irreversible had taken place. Not a scandal, a reckoning, the kind that doesn't shout but changes everything. The silence that followed Jasmine's last words didn't dissolve it, crystallized. It clung to the walls like frost, sharp and still. The courtroom had become a space where breath itself felt like a disruption. No gavel had dropped, no verdict had been read, but everyone knew something irreversible had just happened. Privilege had been named and stripped bare. Barron Trump remained frozen in his seat. The unsealed file lay open beside him, but he didn't glance at it. He didn't need to. The red-inked phrase on that document, Presidential Interest, Expedite Request, had already echoed too loudly. It rang not just in the ears of the jurors, but in the conscience of the room. And conscience, once awakened, doesn't close its eyes again. He stood slowly, every movement deliberate, as if bracing against the weight of the very history he had summoned into the courtroom. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lash out. Instead, he reached for the last shield he had left legacy. My mother served this country as First Lady. That role, its dignity, its sacrifice, that alone is enough to warrant consideration. He delivered it like a closing argument to the soul, a plea not for legal mercy but emotional credit. His voice didn't crack, but it didn't soar either. It hovered, tired, defensive, proud. He looked toward the jury, then toward the judge. But their faces were unmoved. The words hung in the air like an heirloom no one wanted to inherit. Jasmine didn't rise with force. She rose with precision, calm, upright, steady as the floor beneath her heels. She didn't look at Barron. Not once. Her eyes went straight to the judge, to the law, to the center of gravity in that room. There is no section in the immigration code. She said, her voice smooth as steel, called the First Lady exception. And that was it. Not a shout, not a rebuke, a scalpel. Her words cut deeper than any personal attack ever could because they were undeniable. No political spin, no media framing, no family legacy could stretch a law that didn't exist. And suddenly the dignity Barron invoked sounded like a hollow drum, loud but empty. He didn't speak again. His mouth tightened. His shoulders sank just slightly imperceptible to some, but unmistakable to those watching closely. And then for the first time since the hearing began, he lowered his head. Not in shame, not in surrender, but in the quiet realization that the courtroom had slipped from his grasp, not because he lost control, but because he never truly had it. The jurors said nothing, but their silence spoke volumes. Their pens didn't move, their eyes didn't shift, and their posture had changed. They were no longer listening. They were judging. Not just the facts, but the fairness. Not just what was said, but who had dared to speak it. The judge remained still, hands folded, eyes unreadable. But the moment had already passed its verdict. Jasmine sat back down. She didn't gloat. She didn't glance at Barron. She simply folded her hands in her lap and waited. Because in that room, in that silence, the law had finally spoken, not through a statute or a sentence, but through the complete and total absence of applause. And sometimes silence is the only sound truth needs. The courtroom had already been holding its breath for over an hour, but after Jasmine dismantled the First Lady exception with a single sentence, that breath became something heavier, like the room itself was waiting for a final truth to land. Jasmine knew the foundation had cracked. Now it was time to make it crumble. The facts had spoken. The silence had echoed. Now came the voice, and not hers. She rose again, this time with a slower gravity, as though the air had grown thicker. Her eyes didn't scan the gallery or jury. They were locked on the judge. Your Honor, the defense now requests to enter technical evidence into the record internal audio communications and sworn testimony related to procedural anomalies in the processing of the applicant's immigration file. The air changed. You could feel it. Even the people who had been taking discreet notes paused, pens frozen mid-sentence. Barron's lead attorney leaned toward his co-counsel, muttering something with a clenched jaw. Too late. The judge gave a slow, certain nod. Proceed. The doors to the left side of the room opened with a creak that felt louder than it was. A man in his early 40s walked in plain suit, no tie sleeves, slightly creased from stress or habit. His name, Michael Reyes, had appeared on no press release, no article, no leak. But he had lived inside the system, and now he was going to put it on the stand. He raised his hand for the oath, palm flat, finger steady. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. Jasmine walked him through the first few formalities. Title, department, years served. Then she went for the bone. Mr. Reyes, during your time at the agency, were you ever instructed to expedite an immigration application outside of normal written protocol? He didn't blink. Yes, multiple times, but one stood out. What made that instance different? It had a verbal override attached to it. The file was marked presidential interest. We were told to process it immediately, no questions, no review. Was that instruction formalized in any memo, directive, or email? That's the point. It wasn't supposed to be written down. It was passed orally. The way orders are passed when people want them done but never traced. The words dropped like anvils. Quiet, simple damning. Then Jasmine reached for the final blade. She held up a small handheld device, sleek, neutral, but in her hands it felt like a detonator. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to play a 47-second internal audio recording. This was captured during a closed meeting between department supervisors and senior staff in the Federal Processing Division. The judge nodded. No one objected. The lights dimmed slightly as the screen behind Jasmine came to life with a timestamp and waveform. Then the voice began. It wasn't angry, it wasn't dramatic, it was routine. POTUS wants his wife's file done in 90 days. No mistakes, no delays. Just push it through. Don't ask questions, just do it. There was no slur, no tension, just authority, casual, assured, and fully aware of its power. The kind of voice used by people who are certain no one in the room will challenge them. For 47 seconds, the courtroom was frozen. When the audio clicked off, it was as if no one had exhaled. Jasmine gently placed the device back on the table, her expression unreadable. But the storm behind her calm was unmistakable. Barron didn't move. Neither did his lawyers. The jury didn't fidget. No one coughed. Even the judge, composed as ever, seemed to hold his breath a beat longer than necessary. Then at last the gavel tapped once. The court will recess for 30 minutes. Proceedings will resume at 2:15. It wasn't just a break, it was a reckoning delayed by 30 minutes. Because after that tape, after that testimony, after that name was dropped so casually into a backroom order, the courtroom had heard not just how a visa was rushed, but who rushed it, why, and with what expectation of silence. And now that silence was gone. The courtroom returned from recess not with chatter, but with the kind of silence that says everything has changed. No gavel had struck, no headline had run, and yet the energy in room 14B was no longer the same. The audio, just 47 seconds, had torn a hole through the veneer of procedure and exposed something raw beneath. It wasn't just a voice on a recording. It was power unfiltered, commanding the law to serve the personal. And now, as the judge re-entered, every person in the room understood this was no longer about Jasmine Crockett versus Barron Trump. This was about the law versus the illusion of untouchability. The judge walked in slowly, shoulders set, his robe trailing like the last wave of calm before a final verdict breaks. He didn't glance at anyone in particular, yet everyone felt seen. The room rose to its feet, then sat again in near-perfect unison, as though instinctively acknowledging the gravity that was about to land. He took a seat, adjusted his glasses, and let the silence stretch just long enough for every heart in the room to align with the next words. Then, with a voice calm but unmistakably firm, he began. This court has reviewed all admissible evidence, including the authenticated audio recording and sworn testimony from agency personnel. His tone carried the weight of finality, not defensive, not uncertain, but anchored. It is the opinion of this court that the defendant representative, Jasmine Crockett, acted within the full boundaries of protected speech under the law. Her statements were based on verifiable public data and addressed matters of significant public interest. Therefore, the court hereby dismisses the plaintiff's claims of defamation in full. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. Because in that moment, truth had been given form, etched into public record, upheld by law. No flourish, no echo, just clean, undeniable language that landed like stone on glass. Barron didn't move. He sat perfectly still, as if even the smallest reaction would give away too much. But his eyes dropped deliberately, slowly. Not from defeat, not from shame, but from the quiet, internal acceptance that the system he thought would bend had not. Not this time. Not in this room. Jasmine didn't look at him. She didn't have to. Her focus was forward, unmoved by the wind, untouched by the collapse across the aisle. She reached for her folder fingers, brushing the edge like she was holding something fragile. Then, with a slow and deliberate press of her palm, she closed it, not as a gesture of finality, but of containment, to keep her emotions in, to keep the fire from flaring into triumph. Because this wasn't about pride, it was about principle. She didn't smile. She didn't blink away tears. She didn't bask in vindication. She contained. Across the aisle, the plaintiff's attorney leaned in toward Barron and whispered something too soft to catch. But Jasmine didn't need to hear it. She could feel the weight of retreat in their body language. No rebuttal, no objection, no parting shot. Just the quiet dignity of men who had been out-argued, outmaneuvered, and ultimately outmatched not by fury, but by fact. They packed their files slowly, methodically, like soldiers folding up a flag after a surrender. Barron stood last, but even his posture had changed. No longer the image of assured superiority, just a man watching the one truth he couldn't fight settle over him like a shadow. No one in the gallery clapped. No one dared. Because this wasn't a movie, it wasn't theater, it was a reckoning. And in real justice, there is no soundtrack, only stillness. Jasmine sat back, hands clasped over the now-closed folder. Her chest rose with a quiet breath, and in that moment she looked not like someone who had won, but someone who had endured, who had carried a truth through fire and brought it to light without letting it consume her. The silence didn't demand celebration, it demanded respect. And in that silence, justice didn't just arrive, it stood tall. The silence that lingered in courtroom 14B after the final ruling didn't fade. It echoed, rippling outward like a slow-burning fuse traveling beyond the oak-paneled walls of the courthouse. Jasmine Crockett had not just won a defamation suit. She had pulled a thread so precisely, so methodically, that the entire tapestry of unchecked privilege had begun to unravel. And Washington, for all its insulation and tradition, could feel it. It didn't come in the form of outrage or scandal. It came in paper, signed, stamped, federal. Weeks later, on an otherwise quiet Tuesday morning, a low-profile press briefing at the Department of Justice turned into something no one could look away from. There were no major networks broadcasting it live, no celebrity reporters, just a plain podium under fluorescent lights, a row of quietly humming cameras, and a government spokesperson gripping a single sheet of paper that weighed more than it looked. She stepped forward, eyes steady, and cleared her throat. The words were direct, bureaucratic even, but their impact struck like thunder. The Department of Justice is formally opening a special review into high-priority EB-1 visa cases processed between 2015 and 2018, including but not limited to the file of Melania Trump. No shouting followed, no applause. Just the rustle of notebooks flipping open and a dozen recorders clicking on with sudden urgency. This wasn't just a statement. It was a warning shot across decades of quiet favoritism. Every attorney, every immigrant advocate, every policy scholar in the country heard the same thing between the lines. The rules that had once bent silently in back rooms were finally being dragged into the light. The spokesperson continued, voice measured, rehearsed, but you could tell she felt the gravity too. The review will focus on procedural integrity, public transparency, and the reevaluation of previously denied cases under independent oversight. And there it was, those three words that meant everything: independent oversight. No private committees, no backdoor clearance memos. An independent panel charged with reviewing not just one controversial visa, but the whole architecture that had allowed it to slide through unnoticed. The panel was quickly named the 14RA Review Panel, a nod to the courtroom that had shattered the silence. It would include former immigration judges, audit specialists, ethics professors, and human rights observers. Offers were extended to multiple public figures to chair it. Jasmine Crockett's name topped the list, but when the microphones turned toward her, she didn't hesitate. Standing outside the Capitol steps without a prepared statement, she said simply, "I don't need power to do what's right. I just need those files opened and those voices heard." That was all. No speech, no theatrics. Just the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent her entire life holding broken systems, accountable one file, one story at a time. Behind the headlines, beyond the statements, the implications were staggering. Thousands of rejected EB-1 applicants, scientists, doctors, researchers, educators, had never known why their paths were blocked. Now, for the first time, they had reason to believe someone would listen. In a dusty file cabinet in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, was one of those stories. Her name was Ida Jean-Baptiste, a 23-year-old biomedical researcher who had developed an award-winning mobile diagnostic device for neonatal infection. Her invention had won praise from international health forums. She had been profiled by universities in Canada and Switzerland. And yet when she applied for an EB-1 visa to join a research team at Johns Hopkins, her application was denied. No explanation. Just a letter does not meet extraordinary ability threshold. She had cried once, quietly, alone in the cramped kitchen she shared with her aunt and two cousins. Then she packed the rejection away and returned to coding on her cracked Lenovo laptop. Because that's what people like her did, they moved forward. Even when the world closed its doors. That was a year ago. Now sitting at the same kitchen table, eating a piece of buttered toast that had gone cold, she refreshed her inbox like she always did before bed. Only this time, something different blinked back at her. Subject: your EB-1 application is reactivated for priority review. She didn't move for a full minute, didn't blink. The cursor hovered over the message as her eyes scanned the preview again and again, unable to trust it was real. She opened it. Dear Ms. Jean-Baptiste, your previously denied EB-1 application case, ID 4019-A81H, has been selected for expedited reconsideration under the Department of Justice's 14A Review Panel Initiative. No additional forms are required at this time. Please be available for follow-up within 14 days. Respectfully, USCIS Priority Review Division. She dropped her toast. Her breath caught in her throat, and she looked up at the ceiling like it might explain the timing, the shift, the sudden reversal of fortune that had always seemed to be reserved for people with power or those who stood next to it. Her cousin walked in, saw the screen, and asked what was wrong. Ida whispered, barely audible, "They're opening the door again." Across the world, she wasn't alone. In a crowded apartment in Lagos, a 39-year-old quantum physicist who had been denied for insufficient public acclaim received the same email. In Manila, a violinist who had performed on 5 continents but was told her achievements were not nationally significant stared at her reactivation notice, tears falling onto the bowstring in her hand. In Buenos Aires, a rural doctor who had built a solar-powered mobile clinic gasped as his inbox pinged. He hadn't thought about his visa application in 2 years. One by one they reappeared, not on television, not at press conferences, but in inboxes, in midnight texts to family, in the renewed hope of people who had been told quietly and without cause that they were not exceptional enough to cross a border. Now for the first time, someone had turned around and said, "We were wrong. We will look again." Back in D.C., Jasmine Crockett refused interviews. She declined a book deal. She turned down 4 major speaking invitations. She stayed quiet not because she had nothing to say, but because the work was finally speaking for itself. She returned to her office where a stack of unopened letters from people she'd never met continued to grow. Some were long, some just said thank you. Some were handwritten on ruled paper from inside detention centers. Others were typed from Ivy League campuses by former immigrants who remembered what it felt like to wait, then be denied. She didn't read all of them at once. She couldn't. But she did keep one letter on her desk, a photocopy of the email sent to Ida Jean-Baptiste, printed on plain white paper. No signature, no fanfare, just proof that truth, when fought for long enough, becomes action. And that action becomes change. And that change, if protected, becomes justice. No viral speech, no raised fist, no gavel slam. Just an inbox, a breathless pause, and one young woman whispering to no one in particular, "They're opening the door again." Sometimes that's all justice needs. Not noise, just a door and the will to pry it open. The reverberations from the federal courtroom still lingered across Washington, but outside the chambers, the world had already begun shifting in quieter, more unexpected ways. The Department of Justice's announcement had sent a shockwave through the corridors of immigration bureaucracy, setting off a cascade of reactivations and reevaluations. Thousands of files reopened, thousands of lives paused mid-dream, now in motion again. But one name, the name at the center of the storm, remained strikingly, almost unnaturally silent: Melania Trump. No statements, no press conference, no carefully worded social media post. She didn't deny, she didn't defend, she simply disappeared. Not a single reporter could get close enough to shout a question. Her spokesperson issued no rebuttals. She declined every interview. The Trump family's usual strategy, counterattack and deflection, was replaced by a vacuum of sound. And that silence became louder than any outrage. For a time, that was the end of it. The media moved on to the next scandal. The hearings faded from the headlines. Jasmine Crockett quietly returned to her legal work, rejecting the spotlight she had never sought. Those who had witnessed the courtroom reckoning assumed the chapter had closed. But they were wrong. 1 month after the verdict, something strange began happening. Not in courtrooms, not in headlines, but in inboxes of places most Americans had never heard of. At 9:42 a.m. on a Tuesday, a nonprofit in D.C. called the Future Immigrants Fund received a notification from their bank. An anonymous donation of $1,000, $1,000, had just been deposited into their account. No accompanying letter, no donor name, just a silent transfer. 20 minutes later, across the country in Arizona, the New Roots Project received an identical alert, another $1,000, $1,000 from the same financial intermediary. At 11:13 a.m., the Sanctuary Collective in New York received the largest one yet, $1 out of $500, $1,000. 3 nonprofits, 3 deposits, 1 donor. Each organization supported women immigrants, and each had at some point in the past 5 years received rejected applicants who bore EB-1 denial letters that looked eerily similar to Melania Trump's quietly unsealed file. Within hours, whispers began circling. Who had sent it? Why now? The transactions had come from a Florida-based LLC that on paper operated as an antiques import business. A company with no public office, no functioning website, and no digital footprint beyond the standard tax registration and a single address in Palm Beach. Investigative reporters started digging the address traced back to a commercial office complex just 10 minutes from Mar-a-Lago. But inside the Future Immigrants Fund, none of that speculation mattered. On a rainy Thursday morning, Jasmine Crockett was invited for a closed-door conversation at the nonprofit's modest headquarters. No cameras, no press. Just the director, two case managers, and a stack of printouts sitting in a folder marked confidential, unconfirmed. Jasmine arrived without security, dressed in black slacks and a loose blazer. She looked tired not from defeat but from the constant hum of responsibility that had followed her since the moment she asked that first question in hearing room 9A. She didn't sit right away. She stood by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass as the director nervously opened the folder and slid it across the table. Inside, bank confirmations, routing information, entity trace logs, all roads pointed to the same conclusion. The donor had used layers of legal shielding, but the implication was unmistakable. "We don't know who sent it," the director said softly, her voice trembling, with a mix of awe and confusion. But someone chose not to say sorry with words. They chose to say it with action. There was no accusation in her tone, no sarcasm, just a quiet understanding that something rare had happened, a reckoning not in court, but in conscience. Jasmine didn't open the folder. She didn't need to. The truth was already written in the margins. She finally turned away from the rain, crossed the room, and sat down. Her hands remained folded in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was even, but beneath it there was something raw, something elemental, the kind of truth that burns rather than comforts. True justice doesn't need a name on the trophy. It just needs the right result to be left behind. The room fell silent, not in awkwardness, in reverence, because everyone there knew what that line meant. It meant Jasmine wasn't interested in revenge. She didn't need Melania Trump to be humiliated. She didn't need Barron Trump to publicly apologize. She didn't need a camera in her face or a headline in her favor. All she needed was what had just happened. $3.5 million, not to her, not to a campaign, but to the very women the system had quietly shut out for decades. Not for show, not for leverage, not for narrative control, but maybe, just maybe, for something resembling atonement. Jasmine rose from her chair without another word. She nodded politely, shook the director's hand, and walked out of the office into the rain. No umbrella, just her and the gray sky and a quiet calm that she hadn't felt in months. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. But she walked a little slower, as if the world for one brief moment had remembered how to turn the right way. That night, the director of Future Immigrants Fund emailed her staff and volunteers. She didn't give details. She simply wrote, "Change didn't come in a courtroom. It came in silence." And sometimes that's loud enough. No one replied. They didn't need to. A week later, Jasmine received a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of cream stationery with no heading, no seal, no logo. Just one line typed in clean serif font. Some things are better said through action. "Thank you." She didn't frame it. She didn't keep it. She folded it quietly, placed it in the back of her desk drawer behind a worn copy of the U.S. Constitution, and closed the drawer without a sound. Justice, she had learned, wasn't about who speaks loudest. It wasn't even about who wins. It was about what gets corrected and who gets seen in the process. And this time, someone even from behind the veil of power and silence had chosen to see. Not for praise, not for redemption, but for a single moment of rightness. And that was enough. The anonymous letter had long been folded away. The donations had been processed. The panel was already working behind closed doors, changing how visas would be evaluated for generations to come. Jasmine Crockett hadn't stepped into a courtroom since the verdict, yet her presence still echoed down the marble halls of Washington like a note that refused to fade. But while the headlines quieted and the whispers turned to policy memos, something even more profound was happening. The ending was becoming legacy. And then exactly 3 months to the day after the judge closed the file that once bore her name, the final formality arrived, a sealed envelope from the federal clerk's office. Inside, a single sentence: case closed. No further proceedings. There would be no appeals, no rehearing, no courtroom sequel. The case Barron Trump had filed, once wielded like a sword, now lay still, reduced to archival ink. But this wasn't the moment Jasmine Crockett chose to pause. In fact, it wasn't even the moment the world decided to respond. It started with one invitation, then another, then a dozen more. Envelopes bearing the crests of top law schools: Yale, Stanford, Columbia, Georgetown, Berkeley. Each one embossed, each one personal, each one asking for the same thing. We invite you to speak to our graduating class on courage, public integrity, and what it means to hold the system accountable. Some offered keynote fees that rivaled corporate salaries. Others proposed fellowships. All of them promised platforms, microphones, standing ovations, and headlines. But Jasmine said no, not with arrogance, not with bitterness, just with the clarity of someone who had finally seen how much louder action could speak than applause. While the country debated her legacy, Jasmine quietly returned to a small, windowless office on the south side of Houston, a legal aid center where the Wi-Fi barely worked, where two printers shared one toner cartridge, and where every Wednesday morning undocumented mothers lined up at dawn, hoping someone might listen. It was where she had started. It was where she still belonged. Reporters were baffled. Why not take the spotlight? Why not turn victory into power? She gave them no press statement, no justification, only one line spoken quietly to a former client, a woman from Guatemala whose asylum appeal Jasmine had won 5 years prior. I didn't change the world in that courtroom. I just knocked on the right door. The one they kept saying was locked. She didn't need a stage to speak truth. She needed a chair, a case file, and someone forgotten by the system, someone still worth fighting for. On her first day back, the staff surprised her with a small "Welcome Back" sign taped to the wall. It was crooked and hand-drawn in marker. Someone had written "Justice Queen" in purple glitter. Jasmine laughed genuinely, not because she believed it, but because she finally understood why people needed someone to believe in. Before her coffee cooled, 5 walk-ins showed up: 2 visa denials, 1 labor fraud case, and a mother whose son had been detained without a hearing. Jasmine took all 5. No fanfare, no cameras, just a stack of manila folders, a half-dead laptop, and that quiet, unrelenting fire that had carried her through every insult, every courtroom stare-down, every calculated silence. Outside, it began to rain. And inside, Jasmine leaned back in her chair, for the first time all morning, her eyes resting on a bulletin board of old case photos, children reuniting with parents, families hugging in airports, faded thank you notes with smudged crayon drawings. Each one a reminder, this was never about winning a headline. It was about pushing open one door just wide enough for someone else to walk through. And in that moment, with the courthouse far behind her and the headlines long gone, Jasmine Crockett smiled. Because justice wasn't just what happened to her. It was what happened because of her. And now it would keep happening long after the world stopped watching. And as the last storm passed over the quiet legal aid office in Houston, something far greater than paperwork was being closed, a chapter in American reckoning that had never been told through the usual characters. This wasn't about a famous courtroom speech or a fiery political takedown. It was about what it means when one woman refuses to be silenced, refuses to play by the script, and instead chooses to redefine what public service, moral courage, and civic duty actually look like. Jasmine Crockett didn't win in the way the world often measures victory. There was no confetti, no cheers, no headlines screaming her name. What she won was far quieter but infinitely more permanent trust. The trust of people who had given up on the system. The trust of immigrants who had been denied for being unexceptional despite brilliance. The trust of working-class families who watched powerful men weaponize privilege without consequence. And in the silence of that final ruling, with no audience but history itself, Jasmine planted a seed that would grow long after the story faded from screens. The moral clarity of her actions left behind a trail no smear campaign could erase. She could have taken victory laps, cashed in the attention sign book deals, and gone on speaking tours. But instead, she returned to a place with flickering lights and broken chairs, where undocumented mothers waited with trembling hands and hope in their eyes. That's where the real work was. That's where she belonged, not because she was small, but because her vision was big enough to remember the invisible. She knew the cameras would move on, but the families left behind would not. She didn't need a courtroom verdict to validate her. The victory wasn't the judge's ruling. It was in the girl from Haiti who got her second chance. It was in the law students who chose ethics over ego. It was in the quiet transfers of anonymous donations, given not with fanfare, but with conscience. And it was in her choice to keep doing the work long after the world stopped watching. What Jasmine taught this country was not just that the law can be used to hold the powerful accountable, but that the truth still holds value even when it's inconvenient, and that speaking it boldly without apology can shake the ground beneath the highest towers. Her words were never performative. Every sentence she spoke in that courtroom was a match lit against a wall, soaked in silence. And when she said, if this is what qualifies as an extraordinary contribution, then what are the thousands who were denied trash data? It wasn't rhetorical. It was revolutionary. Because millions of people across the country, immigrants, students, veterans, dreamers, saw themselves in those words. And for the first time, someone in power had said what they'd been too scared to voice, that the system wasn't just flawed, it was being gamed, not by the weak, not by the desperate, but by those who knew how to bend every rule and never face a consequence. And Jasmine stood alone in that room and said, not this time. Even more powerful than her courtroom composure was what came after. When law schools begged her to speak, when policy panels offered to put her name in gold, when news networks tried to frame her as the next political star, she said no. Not out of arrogance, but out of commitment. She understood that real change doesn't happen under stage lights. It happens in cramped offices and 17-page visa files and whispered hallway conversations where nobody's filming. She didn't want to become a celebrity of reform. She wanted to stay its engine. And when asked why she turned down all those offers, she said simply, I didn't change the world in that courtroom. I just knocked on the right door, the one they kept telling people was locked. And that statement, humble, raw, razor sharp, became the final thesis of her entire journey. She wasn't interested in unlocking doors for herself. She wanted to rip them off the hinges so nobody ever had to ask permission again. Perhaps the most surprising lesson came not from Jasmine, but from someone who never spoke. Melania Trump didn't defend herself, didn't release a statement, didn't retaliate in the face of public scrutiny. Some saw that as cowardice, others as strategy. But what it became ultimately was a strange, almost poetic gesture of accountability. 1 month after the court decision, 3 nonprofits that support immigrant women received anonymous donations, totaling $3.5 million. The money came from a shell company based in Palm Beach, with no traceable signature, but everyone knew, everyone. And when the director of one of those organizations told Jasmine, we don't know who sent it. But someone chose to apologize without saying a word, there was no need for debate. Because sometimes change doesn't come from a courtroom loss, it comes when someone who once stood behind a locked gate decides to open it quietly with dignity. That single act, anonymous, unclaimed, but deeply symbolic, echoed louder than any press conference ever could. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't post about it. When asked what she thought of the donation, she said only true justice doesn't need a name on the trophy. It just needs the right result to be left behind. In that moment, the story of confrontation gave way to something deeper, a legacy of transformation. The courtroom battle had ended, but the moral weight lingered, reshaping public policy, legal debate, and personal conscience. Jasmine proved that integrity doesn't require titles or rewards. It requires stamina, the ability to stand in fire and not flinch. And that kind of courage is rare. But when it happens, it changes everything. Not just laws, but hearts. Not just headlines, but history. And now as her name fades from trending topics and the nation turns to its next outrage, the true impact of Jasmine's stand begins to quietly bloom. Lawmakers cite her case when reviewing new visa oversight measures. Immigrant applicants mention her name during interviews. And students across classrooms from Boston to Oakland write essays not about a scandal, but about a woman who refused to sit down. Jasmine Crockett's story will not be remembered for the drama, although it had plenty. It will be remembered for the door she proved was never truly locked, only guarded by fear, entitlement, and silence. She didn't wait for someone to give her a key. She knocked loudly, and when nobody answered, she kicked it in. In the end, that is the message this story leaves behind. You don't need to be famous or rich or born into power to move a nation's conscience. You just need to tell the truth, over and over, even when your voice shakes, even when the system laughs, especially then. Jasmine's victory wasn't measured in legal filings or news clips. It was measured in the lives changed the systems questioned and the voices that followed hers through the very door she refused to let stay closed. Justice isn't an event, it's a habit. One person at a time, one truth at a time. And Jasmine Crockett made it impossible to unhear that truth ever again. And as Jasmine Crockett's name gently faded from the headlines and her image returned to the quiet spaces of community work and untelevised advocacy, the real question remained, what now? What do we, the people watching from afar, do with a story like this? A story that pulled back the curtain not just on one visa or one courtroom, but on an entire system where silence has long passed for policy and familiarity has outweighed fairness. We can't afford to treat this as just another chapter in political theater. Because this wasn't theater. This was a woman staring down the weight of privilege and choosing to speak anyway. And now that she has cracked the wall, the responsibility to widen the opening doesn't fall on her alone. It falls on every person who watched her and thought, that's not right, but then looked away. It falls on everyone who has ever said, that's just how the system works, and used it as an excuse, not a challenge. The wall has been breached, so what are we going to do with the opening start where you are? That's the first and hardest truth. You don't need to be Jasmine Crockett to confront injustice. You just need to stop pretending it's someone else's job. If you're a teacher, start with the stories you teach. Make sure your students know how immigration law really works. If you're a lawyer, look at who you represent, and more importantly, who you refuse to. If you're a voter, stop choosing comfort over courage. Stop waiting for candidates who make you feel safe and start backing the ones who make the powerful uncomfortable. Jasmine's fight didn't begin in a courtroom. It began in all the small decisions before that, the ones nobody applauded. It began the day she decided a small immigration case in Houston mattered just as much as a televised trial. That mindset, that belief that every injustice is personal, has to become a habit, not a hashtag. We must hold power accountable even when it wears a smile. Especially then, because sometimes power doesn't show up in jackboots and snarling faces. It shows up in velvet chairs and sealed documents. It shows up in phrases like national interest, executive privilege, or expedited review. And if we don't challenge those phrases, they become scripture. Jasmine did not just challenge the law, she reminded us that laws, when abused, are no better than lies dressed in formal language. Her question in that courtroom, if this is what qualifies as an extraordinary contribution, then what are the thousands who were denied, wasn't just about immigration. It was about every system that rewards familiarity over fairness, loyalty over legitimacy. That question must echo into every institution we care about, from universities to corporations, from courts to churches. Because if we don't ask it, no one else will. And let's be clear, this isn't about left or right. This is about right and wrong. Jasmine didn't take on a party. She took on a pattern of whisper deals, unexamined privilege, and rigged ladders passed off as meritocracy. You've seen it before in promotions handed out behind closed doors, in college admissions that value legacy over labor, in politics that sell access as accomplishment. And now you've seen what it looks like when someone says no, not with a protest sign, not with a viral tweet, but with data, documentation, and a voice steady enough to break through marble silence. That's what courage looks like. And courage, when witnessed, demands imitation, not applause, imitation. So here's what you can do. Demand transparency from every institution that claims to serve the public. Ask your elected officials how visa categories are reviewed. Push for independent oversight panels, not just for immigration, but for every system where discretion has become code for abuse. Support journalists who dig deeper, not just louder. Fund legal aid clinics. Mentor someone who's navigating the system for the first time. Teach your kids that fairness doesn't mean everyone wins, it means everyone plays by the same rules. And most of all, listen. Really listen. To the woman whose accent makes you lean in. To the man who doesn't know the right legal term but knows he was wronged, to the teenager who thinks nobody will believe her because she wasn't born here. Because that's where it begins, not with policy, but with presence. We also must stop waiting for heroes to fix what we're unwilling to face. Jasmine didn't walk into that courtroom with backup. She walked in alone. And she didn't win because she had power, she won because she didn't flinch. You can do the same. Whether it's calling out the unfair policy in your office, challenging bias in your boardroom, or speaking up in a school meeting where a special exception starts to feel a little too familiar, do not wait for permission to speak. Your silence won't protect you. It will only protect the problem. And if you're afraid good, that means you understand the stakes. Speak anyway, because here's the secret no one tells you. Change doesn't require a majority. It requires momentum. One person pushing hard enough can start the slide. Jasmine didn't just push, she bulldozed. And now the question is, will you stand behind the breach and watch, or will you step through and start building something better on the other side? Her story isn't finished just because the case is closed. That story is now in your hands. What will you do with it? What will you risk for someone you've never met but whose dream was once quietly discarded for someone else's shortcut? In the end, this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a reminder of who we are when no one's watching. Jasmine Crockett showed us that dignity is not a privilege. It's a muscle. And like any muscle, it only grows when used. So use it. In boardrooms, in ballot boxes, in classrooms, in courtrooms, in every quiet place where someone whispers, "That's just how it is," raise your voice and say, "It doesn't have to be," because it doesn't, and because now you've seen what happens when someone does. Don't let that be the last time. History isn't made by the loudest voices, it's made by the clearest ones. And Jasmine Crockett's voice rang clear, not just in court, but in the conscience of a country too long resigned to double standards and soft corruption. That voice doesn't belong to her alone anymore. It belongs to all of us, every person who watched, who listened, who felt something shift. So don't waste that feeling. Turn it into action. Because real justice isn't handed down, it's handed off. From one brave hand to another, now it's your turn. And if you're still wondering whether one person can actually make a difference, ask yourself this. Why did they try so hard to silence her? Why was Jasmine Crockett met with lawsuits, accusations, and veiled threats? Not because she lied, but because she told the truth in a room that had grown allergic to it. Power doesn't waste its weapons on the harmless. It only retaliates when someone strikes too close to the heart. That's why stories like this one matter, not because they flatter us, but because they challenge us. They ask, what doors have we walked past without knocking? What truths have we swallowed because confrontation felt inconvenient? What systems have we benefited from silently while pretending to be neutral? Neutrality when injustice thrives is just another costume for complicity. Jasmine didn't stay neutral. Neither should we. In every generation, there is a quiet handoff, a moment where a baton is passed not on a stage, but in the choices we make when no one's clapping. Maybe you're not a lawyer. Maybe you'll never stand in front of a judge. But maybe, just maybe, you're the one who listens when no one else does. Maybe you're the teacher who sees brilliance in a refugee child. The employer who hires based on potential, not pedigree. The neighbor who opens your door when others are told to build walls. That's where the real work is. Not just in what we challenge, but in what we choose to honor. Dignity, fairness, truth. And the belief that no human being is illegal, irrelevant, or expendable. Jasmine's legacy isn't a monument, it's a mirror. And it's asking you to look. Because the truth is, no law is permanent if the people behind it are courageous enough. No system is untouchable if someone is willing to bleed for change. The courtroom might have closed its file, but this story is far from over. It lives on every time a young girl with an accent refuses to be silenced. Every time a man in a detention center writes one more appeal letter instead of giving up. Every time a voter refuses to choose the quieter candidate and instead chooses the braver one. These are not small acts. These are seismic shifts disguised as daily choices. And when enough of us make them, the system has no choice but to move. Not because it wants to, but because it has no other option. So let this be your reminder. Justice isn't just something we demand from others. It's something we become in how we live, lead, and love. It's in the paperwork we refuse to ignore, the policies we fight to change, the stories we choose to tell around our tables, our classrooms, our streets. Let Jasmine Crockett's story remind you that even when they call you disruptive, defiant, or unqualified, you speak anyway. Even when the room goes quiet, you keep going. Because somewhere out there, someone else is listening. And your voice might be the thing that keeps them from giving up. That's how it works. One spark becomes another, and before long, a fire starts that no courtroom, no sealed file, no buried secret can contain. So let it burn. Let truth burn through silence. Let courage burn through fear. Let justice burn through every lie that ever hid behind procedure. And then when someone asks what you did when the system bent too far, you'll have an answer. You didn't just believe, you acted. And like Jasmine, you knocked on the door, then held it open for the next person in line. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.